Some students of the Bible may be surprised to hear that the Hebrew text that scholars work from is not perfect. From missing letters to missing words to incomprehensible phrases to wrong spellings and many other issues, the Hebrew text from which all English translations are based has errors. It is scholars who, using various means that have developed over many years, attempt to make sense of the text so that readers and students can have reliable translations, or at least translations that make sense. The Hebrew text from which modern translations are made is called the Masoretic text. It is really a textual tradition. The current standard critical edition of the Hebrew Bible is published under the name Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and the Hebrew text upon which this published version is based is the Leningrad Codex, a text that dates from around 1008 or 1009 AD. The Leningrad Codex is the most complete ancient version of the Hebrew Bible, and is a part of a group of manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible that were transmitted by Jewish scribes from the Second Temple period until the Middle Ages. The Hebrew text is actually an amalgamation of several different traditions, three of them being the original consonantal text, the matres lectionis, and the vocalization or vowel points. The consonantal text is the earliest element of the Hebrew Bible. The earliest texts from the Hebrew Bible may have been written around the 10th century BC, and the latest around the 2nd century BC. From the earliest written editions of the biblical texts until the text was codified in the 1st century AD, these texts were transmitted independently and in varying qualities over hundreds of years. The matres lectionis, or mothers of reading, are letters such as yod and vav that were added to the consonantal text to represent long vowels and facilitate reading. Although some of these were original to the text, others were added throughout the history of the text to facilitate the reading. The third and final part of the textual tradition is the vocalization or vowel points. These vowel points were added to preserve the oral reading traditions and to remove any ambiguities in the reading of the text. The vocalization signs were created between 500 to 700 AD, but were not fully developed until around the 10th century AD. This means that for more than 500 years, the reading tradition of the Hebrew Bible was passed down orally, and it took almost 1,000 years after the consonantal text was codified for the vocalization traditions to be codified themselves. There are actually multiple vocalization traditions: Tiberian, Palestinian, and Babylonian. All this to say, the Hebrew text we now have developed over a long period of time. It seems reasonable to assume, and evidence bears this out, that there are errors in the text of the Hebrew Bible. Some of these are minor, the wrong vowel or letter, but others are significant. Sometimes an entire line or more has been lost, and some errors are simply inexplicable. Scholars, however, have developed methods to understand the textual errors that exist, explain them, and in many cases correct them, so that the text can be understood correctly. This method is called textual criticism. Since it is almost axiomatic that exegesis must begin by establishing the text, all biblical students and scholars should be familiar with textual criticism. Textual criticism has been defined in various ways by scholars in the modern period. However, a good working definition is the attempt to discover the original form of a text. The problem, however, is how one defines what the original form is. This difficulty notwithstanding, the following will introduce textual criticism based on the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is actually very well preserved. Compared to other biblical books, Ecclesiastes does not contain many textual issues. This may in fact be evidence to the lateness of the text. There simply wasn't much time for errors to creep in during the short transmission process of the text. Nevertheless, there are textual issues in the book of Ecclesiastes. In fact, the very first verse of Ecclesiastes introduces us to the idea of textual witnesses. A textual witness is a source that preserves the biblical text. The most important witnesses include the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, or the early Greek translation of the Hebrew text, other early Greek translations, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Aramaic Targums, or early Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible. Other important witnesses include early Latin translations like the Vulgate, the Peshitta, the Syriac translation of the Bible, and others. The three most important, though, are the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Each of these witnesses preserve various readings of the biblical text. Therefore, when two or more of these witnesses preserve different readings, or variants, scholars must make a decision about which reading or variant is original, though that is putting it a bit simplistically. The Masoretic text of Ecclesiastes 1 verse 1 reads, the words Kohelet, son of David, king of Jerusalem. However, the Septuagint provides a slightly different reading. It reads the words of Ecclesiastes, son of David, king of Israel in Jerusalem. The Septuagint contains a variant, in this case a plus reading, since it contains the word Israel, which the Masoretic text does not have. Unfortunately, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not preserve this portion of Ecclesiastes, and the Aramaic Targum supports the Masoretic text. A textual critic is forced, based on this variant reading, to determine which one is original. To do so, one question that a scholar will ask is, based on known phenomena in the transmission of the texts and scribal practices, how can the variant readings be explained? Another way to put this is it more likely that the word Israel was lost at some point in the transmission of the Hebrew text, and the Septuagint preserves an original reading? Or that the word Israel was added to the Septuagint at some point in its transmission? To answer this, we could reflect on scribal practices and habits, one of which tends to be that over time, scribes tend to expand a text rather than take away from it. There are no indicators in the text itself that a scribe would have simply overlooked the word Israel when copying the text. Therefore, the best explanation is that a scribe at some point felt that it was helpful to add Israel in verse 1. It is possible the scribe or translator had Ecclesiastes 1 verse 12 in mind, which states that Kohelet was king over Israel in Jerusalem, and decided to add the word Israel in verse 1. However, this doesn't explain why the scribe didn't write Al Yisrael or Epi Israel in verse 1. Nevertheless, it's almost certain that the Masoretic text is likely the original text. In chapter 2 verse 3, two Hebrew manuscripts, the Septuagint and the Peshitta, read under the sun. The question is, which readings are original? Is it more likely that the original Hebrew text read under the heavens or under the sun? Is it likely that the versions preserve original readings, or that the translators and scribes changed heavens to sun in order to conform these verses to the more common phrase under the sun found throughout Ecclesiastes? A different type of text critical issue is found in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 verse 8, in the third feminine singular independent pronoun he. This is an issue of what is commonly referred to as a ketev kere issue, that is, what is written versus what is read. The Masoretes have noted, as seen in the pointing of the word, that while the consonantal texts reads a third feminine singular pronoun, one should actually read a third masculine singular pronoun. This demonstrates that the Masoretes at some point developed a reading tradition that interpreted this third feminine singular pronoun as a third masculine singular pronoun. This reading tradition is supported by the Targum, two Hebrew manuscripts, and the Syriac. The issue here is to what does the pronoun refer? If it is he, then it could refer to the land, which is grammatically feminine, or perhaps prophet, Yitron. Or perhaps the pronoun refers to the situation in the preceding verse, or the situation in the clause that follows. However, if the word is to be corrected according to the Masoretes' reading tradition to the third masculine singular pronoun who, then perhaps the pronoun refers to the king. In this way, the verse would read, "And a prophet of land, he is over all things, a king of a tilled land." How do we explain these variants? If we trace the variant to an early period in the transmission of the text, it is possible that a scribe would have mistook a vav for a yod, since the two letters looked similar in the Second Temple period. Is it more likely that the letter was a yod or a vav? This is impossible to say, and the text critical issue cannot be decided on the basis of a textual tradition or known scribal patterns or errors. This is a case in which the interpretation, albeit of an already difficult passage, aids in textual criticism. Another issue that seems to have occurred in the textual transmission of Ecclesiastes is the misunderstanding on the part of the scribes on the proper division of words. For example, in Ecclesiastes 7:27, the Masoretic text reads, Amara Kohelet, which means Kohelet said. However, by this reading, the verb is a third feminine singular katal form. This reading does make sense in light of the fact that the word Kohelet is grammatically a feminine participle. However, in chapter 1 verse 2 and chapter 12 verse 8, the word Kohelet is taken to be masculine, and the masculine singular form of the word Amar is used. The form found in chapter 7 verse 27 can be explained by assuming that at some point a scribe misunderstood that the letter he was not a suffix for the verb, but rather a definite article for Kohelet. Therefore, the original text may have read Amar HaKohelet. The meaning of the verse doesn't change, but it does show that in some cases, issues in the text can be explained by a scribe misunderstanding word divisions. These select issues from the book of Ecclesiastes represent some of the many textual issues that scholars wrestle with when attempting to make sense of the Hebrew text. These issues may seem rather trite. However, other texts in the Hebrew Bible have significant textual issues. Nevertheless, be aware that as you read, you may encounter textual errors, and that your English translations are efforts by scholars to interpret and make sense of a text as best as they can.